Okay, terrific. Well, welcome everyone to Miskatonic Repository Convention, or MRCon 2020. I am one of the writers on the Miskatonic Repository. You can find me there under Heinrich Mohr, and I am also one of the organizers of this convention for authors on the Miskatonic Repository, or folks thinking of publishing there, to sort of have a chance to run their products and to hopefully learn something to improve their skills going forward. And central to that, we've got today's panel on writing for the Miskatonic repository. We've got a really terrific panel that I'm very excited to talk with. Go around the room, and I'll just ask everyone to sort of briefly introduce themselves, if you would, starting perhaps with Mr. Mike Mason.
Hello. Hi, I'm Mike Mason. I'm the creative director for Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium. So I spend all my time either writing, editing, developing Call of Cthulhu books, scenarios, campaigns, source books, and everything else. And that's me.
Terrific. And I'm going to keep jumping around here. Mr. Jon Hook.
Good morning. My name is Jon Hook. I am a podcaster and writer. I have written for Golden Goblin Press and Chaosium, and I have a few items available on the Miskatonic Repository, and I'm a co-host for the Miskatonic University podcast.
Terrific. Thank you, Jon. And Mr. Matt Sanderson, would you introduce yourself?
Hello there, I'm Matt, one of the co-hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast, also a freelancer who's done work for games revolving around the machinations of the great old ones for Chaosium, Stygian Fox, Cubicle 7, Pelgrane Press, a few people.
Terrific. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Oscar Rios.
Hi, my name is Oscar Rios. I'm the president of Golden Goblin Press. I am an author, an editor, a project manager. I've worked for Stygian Fox, Chaosium, so I do a lot of freelance writing as well. And a graduate of the monograph system, which is connected in some spiritual way to what we'll be talking about today.
Well, and Oscar, maybe let's take a pause there. Can you quickly tell us what the monograph series was?
The monograph series way back was Chaosium's first attempt at letting fans produce content. They would give you a platform to get your thing, get your product out there, to take your concept. If they approved it, they thought it was a good idea, you put it together, you send it to them, they will put it into print and PDF, and the fans will get it. It was really reliant on what you sent in, so there was minimal editing, if any. You had to supply your own art, your own maps, so you were really, you were all in. You were shipped. You were not only the author but the manager, project manager, editor, and a lot of these were really great, and they launched a bunch of careers.
Thanks, Oscar. Mike, you'll be glad to hear that when we had MOB Michael O'Brien on the publishing panel yesterday, he made the pitch that while in many respects the Miskatonic Repository is sort of molding itself in some ways on the D&D DMs Guild, Call of Cthulhu sort of actually beat that concept to the punch, to the clock with the monograph series.
Yeah, sure. No, Oscar's absolutely right. It was one of those, some years ago in the old days of old Chaosium, and there was, various things going on at the time. So it was a great way of not only, providing an opportunity for people to, get some experience and put some of their kind of work out there. For Chaosium, it was an opportunity to kind of just make sure there was some cool material coming out for Call of Cthulhu at that time. As Oscar said, there were many, it did go on for a number of years, and there were a number of kind of monographs that, I still talked about today and are still available as, PDFs and things like that, that, have some longevity and some, some real kind of good work. But again, there was no editorial oversight to them really at all. And so they were a little bit of a mixed bunch. There's some really good ones and there's some not quite so good ones. But at the end of the day, giving everyone an opportunity to kind of, have a go at, putting some of their own work out there is never a bad thing. And the repository, this kind of new evolution of that kind of idea, really, Drive-Thru has provided a kind of perfect vehicle for that now. There's a lot more kind of ability for creators to kind of manage their work in that way, and not only to put together a book or scenario and put it on the repository, but the fact that they can continue to kind of evolve it and develop it. They can put it out there and get feedback and kind of think, actually, that's a really good idea. I want to build that in and further develop the product, because they're all PDF based. So it's a great way of getting something out there, but also getting feedback and learning that process of developing your work, which is another skill, as well as just actually writing the work, is understanding, how you can hone it and improve upon it as you go through different kind of rewrites and development.
Well, and I think it's incredibly encouraging for a lot of the folks that we hope are participating in this convention and writing on the MR to know that this is, in a sense, the latest iteration, and that there is a whole cast of authors, some of you, yourselves on the panel, in part a result of that, and to think that there's a new generation of authors maybe coming up who are kind of finding their legs on that. So I know we're really appreciative of that opportunity. So yesterday's panel on publishing, of course, talked about what the Miskatonic Repository is, how to publish, how to promote. If folks are interested in all of that, really encourage you to check out our video. We've posted it on the convention Facebook page, also the event page for the convention. And if you need a link, I'm sure in the chat we'll be able to provide that as well. But today we're going to be talking about I'm not going to say the hard work, because promoting your product and publishing, that's all incredibly hard work, but maybe the underlying work, the writing part. And we're sort of going to dig in. I'll be asking questions from the panelists, but that said, I hope all of you gentlemen will feel comfortable sort of responding. If there's something any of you share that you really want to react to, just dive in. Our audio quality seems to be very good. If we get any echoes, chat has been very good about alerting us to that fact, and then we'll mute and we'll figure out any technical issues. But so far, smooth sailing. So I'm very excited about that. Of course, the majority of products on the MR are scenarios. So I'm thinking that we'll focus our discussion on scenario writing, but that said, hopefully we'll also have time to get into some non-scenario writing. So with that, even before we get into the process that each of you use in writing your products, I'm very curious how you start. So there's kind of the blank page analogy, right? You've got the blank page. How do you even begin coming up with an idea? Or do you not confront that blank page until you already sort of have a concept in mind? And John, I'm hoping that you can sort of take the lead on this maybe and walk through where, when there are so many products already out there, so many great scenarios, how do you come up with your ideas for what to write?
Thank you. Sometimes it's just an image. You might think of a scene, and you want to try and build backwards from that scene. I have a scenario on the Miskatonic Repository called Spark of Life, and that the genesis for Spark of Life is I had this image of someone standing on like a parapet at the very top of a house. With a lightning rod behind him and a tiny little iron fenced deck, and in the middle of a storm, this thunder god cloud descends and red lightning, comes to strike out. And I was like, that seems kind of cool. How do I do that? So I started going backwards, and I created a great old one. I created this red lightning god, and what was it, and where does it live, and who would worship it, and why, and started going backwards from there, and ended out writing Spark of Life. And so, yeah, you have to, for me, sometimes it's a scene, and then figuring out what to write for it. With Spark of Life, as an example, I was like, well, is this something that I want a team of investigators to be on? Where should it be set? And for that one, I ended up going solo. So it's one that it's a one keeper, one player, something I call a isolated investigator. And it's something that it gets real intimate, because it's just the two players, the keeper and player, and it makes it go pretty fast, actually. So it's a lot of fun.
It almost sounds like maybe some of these ideas can be you're starting with the climax and then working your way back from that.
Yep.
Matt, what about you? I saw you nodding at some of what Jon was saying there.
Yeah, the similarities to my approach there. The analogy that I kept going through my mind is almost like making candy floss. That start off with either it could be a place, an event, an item, or even if I want to make the scenario revolve around a particular monster or god, that forms like the stick, the central axis for me. And then turning it around in the machine and layering it with, say, layer upon layer of candy floss that might be from research that then me thinks, oh yeah, this could be something that I could bolt in here, or thinking, oh, this could then lead to this, and it almost like snowballs in becoming its own thing, just wrapped up in layer of more material through research and through sitting down and thinking what would logically follow one thing after another. But it all starts with something that's really hooked me as something that I'm interested in. But say it could be a scene, it could be any of those items I listed.
Oscar,
Yes.
we were talking earlier about sort of before the panel even began, kind of the publishing dimension. But I'm really interested in your perspective on this question of where to come up with these ideas.
Well, I think that if you asked 50 authors their process of beginning and their inspiration, you're going to get 50 different answers. You may get some that are very similar, but every author has their own approach and their own method. It's kind of their fingerprint. My personal, and you have to figure out what works for you and lean into that. Don't try and write like anyone else. Try and write the best version of yourself. Use your own method. For me, I don't picture a scene. I'll picture, usually I'll say, what kind of a scenario do I want to write? Do I write something survival horror? Do I want to write something more mystery? Do I want to write something more pulpy? And I'll have the rhythm of the scenario in mind before the topic. And then I just look at what scares me, look at what concerns me, either in current events, history, what I've found, what sparked my interest in at that moment. What are my current concerns? And then you blend those two, and you come up with a scenario idea. For me, I will have an idea in my head rolling around on tumble cycle until, almost like a river rock, it's all smoothed out and I can start writing. Some of these stay in that tumble cycle with me figuring it out, just going back and thinking about this scenario, honestly, for years at a time. And sometimes I'll feel like this is a really good scenario, but I don't think I have the chops as a writer to write it. And then 2 years later, after I've pushed myself and grown, I'll think, you know what? Now is the time. I think I could pull this idea off. And I've done that time and time again. There were some scenarios that had to wait 2 or 3 years for me to finally have the confidence to write them. And there are some that I'm still not confident enough to attempt to write, that I'm still tumbling them around in my head. But that's me. Everyone needs to kind of figure out what their process is to bring it from concept to conclusion.
That's great. Mike, 50 different authors, 50 different opinions, but what's yours?
I I don't have any one thing. I sometimes, I guess what happens to me is a little bit like Oscar. The idea will come to me, while I'm driving, when I'm reading something will just spark. I'll be reading maybe some nonfiction, something from history maybe, and there'll be a certain thing. It could be a location, thing, person, or just a kind of comment in the book that just kind of sticks with me like Oscar, and then will churn around in my head, and that may become something down the line. Often I think about a kind of a situation, and it could be the climax, it could be the start. What would be an interesting kind of start to get the game going? What would be an interesting kind of mystery or situation? But sometimes that is maybe trying to think of a moral dilemma. What would be what would cause players a headache? That would kind of really kind of grip them, but force them to make hard choices, and try and think of things that might layer onto that in a similar fashion to as Matt builds his candy floss. But I think ultimately, what I would want to say at this point is, whatever, if you're just starting out actually writing for someone else, because obviously you can write for yourself, you can write on a post-it note a couple of bullet points and run a scenario if you wish, or write the whole thing. And if only you are ever going to run it, that's cool. But once you start writing for somebody else, obviously you're not only conveying, what is a scenario, you're trying to convey your ideas, and you're trying to convey how you think the scenario should run, and you're effectively building this toolkit. So whatever it is that you start with, the number one rule for me is do it. If you're thinking about it, that's great. Don't think too long. Start writing, because through the writing you'll begin to, as Oscar said, you'll learn your process, but it will take time. And the only way to learn that is to start. And obviously speak to lots of people who have lots of ideas, and ideas are really cool. We all need ideas to make things work. But if you want to actually make something, you've got to start making it, and that's starting to write. And often that hurdle is the biggest one to get over, to just have the confidence to say, I'm going to write this out. And just, my advice is do it. It may be rubbish what you write, but the next time you sit down and write, it may be better. And every time you write, it hopefully will get better and better and better as you learn your craft, basically.
I think one of the things that's really great about the MR is that the entry cost is so low, right? There's no one telling you cannot upload this. There's no one telling you have to charge money, although you probably should, because your labor is valuable. But you can put something up there. You can get feedback on it. And Mike, to your point of starting something and finishing it, I'm reminded of some advice that if you only ever think about something, you're never going to get better at it, right? You have to bring it to completion, so that you've written a bad ending. Great, and maybe the next ending you write is going to be better. But if you never get to the ending, you're never going to improve writing endings. There was something that both you and Oscar mentioned, Mike, which was sort of ideas coming to you as you are reading other things. And I have in my mind sort of all of you like poring over historical tomes and peculiar periods of history for inspiration. But I'm just curious, when these ideas come to you, are you doing casual reading? Are you doing kind of driven reading? Like, okay, I'm interested.
Just existing in the world. You never know when a bit of inspiration will hit you. It could be watching the evening news and seeing something, that just strikes you as particularly horrific, or definitely historical documentaries on cable or the internet. It could even be a meme. Just two examples. There was a massive blizzard in the 1920s that covered most of the United States, and people were like snowed in, like literally several feet of snow blanketing cities and just freezing them in place. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be a great setting for a scenario to have like an apartment building in Chicago during one of these catastrophic blizzards in the 1920s, or there were massive hurricanes through Key West in about the same in the 1920s as well that destroyed the rail lines. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to do like a disaster survival of a hurricane in the 20s in Key West? And again, those are just two more rocks in the tumbler, two more scenario ideas that I'm rolling around in my head. There's a much more recent one, but I don't want to offer any spoilers because I have a scenario on Shoggoth.net called Halloween in the Time of COVID. That was inspired by recent events in the news. That's something I saw that was particularly horrific, and I'm like, wow, there's a scenario in that, and then it becomes a scenario.
Well,
sometimes, sorry, I was just going to speed up what Oscar said. Sometimes you get this idea, and you can't. It's not really enough for a scenario, and you kind of, it's kind of cool, and it kind of sparks something in you, but it's not enough. And then, a month later or a year later, you read something else or see something else, and suddenly they kind of connect together. You don't mean to do it, but they kind of connect. You go, oh, that kind of makes it a whole thing. That if I take that bit of ingredient and that bit of ingredient, I've now actually got the kernel of a plot or something. So sometimes it's just, how these things kind of bash around and filter in your head, really, and how they combine.
Well, I can tell you're already inspiring folks, because chat is coming up with scenario ideas involving a lizard blizzard. So we'll see if we have a full scenario.
Is that a blizzard caused by a lizard or a blizzard of lizards?
I like the idea.
Either one could work.
I think chat's going to express some opinions on that. John, Matt, can you share any of the, I'll say resources, but any of the things that you tend to sort of sometimes get ideas through reading or observing?
Sure. Beyond the readings and things like that, it's also just places that you might visit and see something. So not long ago, my wife and I took a trip and visited a museum that's inside an old sanitarium, and it was just fascinating to go through this museum and see all the different articles and things that have been kept and documented from that period of this insane asylum. There were people, and I don't remember what the name of the disorder is, that would just eat anything. And there was a display of this array of things this woman had eaten. Light bulbs, broken bits of light bulbs, nails, buttons, rocks. And, there's a scenario idea right there. Who is continuing to eat? Mike.
I was going to say, that sparked an idea. What you can have is the investigators need to find this bit of information that's maybe in a tome, but then they find that your person has eaten it as part of their act.
Yeah. Yeah. My thought is what is going to be birthed after enough of the components have been eaten, right? I mean, there's just, something that's going on there that, this happens in real life, right? I learned about the ice pick lobotomies from that museum visit, which is, just horrific in its own sense. But, what happens when you disconnect someone's humanity through a ice pick lobotomy? What do you unleash from that, right? So you can get inspiration from all kinds of sources. So I encourage people to visit museums and go places where things are weird. Those road stop places where someone has set up paper mache dinosaurs. Stop by there. You don't know what they've got. See what's in there, and maybe there's a footprint in some mud that they've preserved, and you can get inspiration from that. So there's lots of weird around you. You got to find it.
I will share that if you are driving on your way to New Orleans in the United States, there is a place called Foamhenge, which is a accurate reproduction of Stonehenge, all in foam.
Nice.
I think there's a Cornhenge somewhere too in the Midwest.
By the way, chat tells us, and this has been verified by a couple of folks in chat, that the disorder is called pica, although it may be pronounced differently. Matt, what about you?
Oh, mine kind of riffs off what John said there, that if you go to these weird attractions and so on that you find out while you're driving, normally in the gift shop they'll have this little section of a bookcase or a shelf that has usually little small thin volumes of like weird tales of this particular county or this state, and those are a goldmine. There's lots over here where they have like ghost stories of Northamptonshire or murder, mystery and mayhem in Nottinghamshire, and you can go through them and find these little bits of just Fortean historical fact, or fact in inverted commas, that you can use as quite a gold mine for thinking, well, what if that was the spark of a scenario? Or what if that was in fact the cover story for something weirder, just so that they make sure that the truth didn't get out there. But yeah, I've got loads of collections on myths, legends, folklore, ghost stories, Fortean events, weird history, actually dotted around me in various bookcases around here.
I think the the comment one of you made of just being out in the world is so important, especially right now. Bit difficult perhaps under the circumstances, but I think some of us probably get somewhat tunnel vision when we are trying to work on an idea and we don't think to ourselves, we need to go out and expose ourselves to other sources of information, because that can jury-rig or push along an idea that maybe you're not making progress on. One of the things Oscar mentioned, this image of a tumble dryer of ideas going around and around, and how sometimes it takes years before you feel like you're in a place to put together a scenario, the kernel of an idea of which has been kind of germinating for a while. How do you all keep track of those ideas? Because I imagine from what you're describing, there must just be loads of these. And let's start with Mike.
Well, I have two kind of ways of doing this. If it's a really good idea, or I think it's a really good idea, I will write it down. Or if I'm driving, I will try and press some phone to do a quick voice message and just shout out some random words to my phone that or I'm not in a position to write it or record it. It just kind of goes, and then it disappears, and I've forgotten it. And then sometimes I just let all these ideas still jumble around, and the ones that keep coming back to me, I tend to kind of feel are the stronger ones, because they're the ones that have interested me. So they're the ones I'm more likely to want to write about. So sometimes I'm sitting around thinking, I'll just go over my notebook, and I keep loads of notebooks. I'm constantly kind of writing ideas in them, and some of them never get looked at again. And some days, I just open a notebook and I flick through ideas I wrote 10 years ago, and I look at them all and think, oh, they're all rubbish. But one may jump out, and they go, actually, that now has inspired me now. So it's whatever works for you, having a big list of things on a spreadsheet, having voicemail, having a notebook, whatever works for you.
John, I saw you proudly brandishing a notebook just now. Is that your idea notebook, or is it just a notebook that you have on your desk?
No, it's a notebook that I keep a lot of my ideas in. I'll jot things down as I'm reading, or a lot of times if I'm at work and I'm zoning out from a meeting that's droning on for too long, I'll start doodling sketches or putting down little note ideas. I also just like Notepad, the Microsoft Notepad. Everything's unformatted, so I can write things that might look like a URL, and it's not going to hyperlink. I like it in just a raw form that I can put anything down, it'll be fine. And I store notepads that just have weird little names on them, like, oh, this is an idea for a blue alien, and I'll just kind of put ideas in that. But yeah,
I'm sure it's a bit terrifying for many of us for you just to be sort of like waving what to us are occult mythos tomes, in your webcams. But Matt, you waved one yourself. Is that your idea notebook?
One of many. I've filled quite a few of these over the last few years. Generally, like moleskin notebook size. I get through one every couple of years, but they're where I tend to start to develop ideas in. That if it's something that's just like a kernel of an idea, that if I'm surfing the net or watching a documentary or something like that where I've got access to my email, I'll just copy a URL, drop it into an email, mail it to myself, because I am useless with bits of paper. Books I can keep track of, but bits of paper just seem to vanish into the ether somehow. So at least I can't lose an email. So I'll send it to myself, keep it in a folder, and then every so often go back through the folder and think, oh yeah, I remember that idea now. And then if it's something that sparks a bit more of an interest, then it'll end up in the notebook and starts getting to be written up a bit more.
I'm reminded of an awkward moment in my own life when I was driving and had an idea, which I now cannot remember, and dictating to Google an email to send myself so that I would not forget it.
I for me, again, everybody's process is going to be different. If I could just jump in, I try not to keep too many ideas floating at one time. There are some that have been there for a really long time, and then there are some that have come in, and I know I'm going to write them soon, just to get them out of my system so I can make room for other ideas. Again, this is only my personal process. I find that if I make out a whole bunch of notes detailing my scenario idea, I'm less inclined to go back and write that scenario, because just the process of writing out those notes has gotten it out of my system. So I usually either just keep it in concept, or I will just jot down bullet point note and an outline on a few bits of pad paper. I actually was cleaning up my den and I found this is actually the outline for a Cthulhu Invictus scenario that I've written, and it's that simple. I mean, these are just my bullet point ideas, but I think for me it would be dangerous to make a lot of notes of a lot of different ideas, because I'd forget those. I wouldn't be as excited or as in love with the idea. So usually I will have 3 or 4 ideas, and I know one of them is going to be my next scenario. I just know that when one of these kind of comes into focus, that's going to be the next thing I write. Usually when I'm writing something, I already know the next thing I'm going to write. So I have them all, queued up, like airplanes airplanes waiting for a runway to land. And I have the air traffic control saying, okay, we're writing this. When this is done, I'm giving myself 2 weeks. Then I'll give myself half a week to recharge, and then I'll start writing this. But I'm weird. Most writers don't write like that.
I would also kind of just throw in, given that people maybe watching this maybe aren't as experienced writers as the illustrious company I'm in at the moment. If you're new to the whole process, really, if it's your first 1 or 2 scenarios you're trying to put together, just be aware that try and keep it simple. What your task now is not to produce the best scenario you could possibly ever write. What your task is to produce a scenario, because once you've done that once, you can then carry on and then produce the best scenario you're ever going to write. But to produce that one scenario, you need to keep the focus on it. Keep it fairly simple. Keep it fairly short. Keep it. Think about it. May be as simple as, I really like ghouls or shoggoths, so I want to do a scenario about ghouls. Just do that. Just keep it very simple. There's a graveyard. There's some ghouls. Throw the players in, and something will happen. There you go. There's a scenario. But keep the focus down, because as you're writing it, you will get more ideas, and some of those ideas may fit really well, but a lot of them are probably nothing to do with this scenario. So that's fine. Just write them on a bit of paper over there. Forget about them. Keep your focus on the scenario to get it done. Because once you've done, you can kind of say, does this work? You can play test it. And it may be that you look back at the ideas you wrote down while you were writing it, and now you can see how some of them might fit in, or they may not. But, remember the job is to get a scenario done. That's number one. Once you've done that, then you can carry on.
So,
And if I may,
I got to chime in. Okay, go, John. Then I've got a thought.
go ahead, John.
I was going to say, Call of Cthulhu as a game is on the cusp of turning 40 years old. And in that time, scenarios have matured in the way that we write them and the way that they are presented. And so for aspiring writers, I encourage you to if you can, even if it's just through PDFs, take a look at some of the older scenarios that have been written, and then look at some of the current scenarios. And again, like Mike said, keep it short. There's two great books that are out now that are great examples of shorter scenarios. You've got Doors to Darkness and Gateways to Terror. And both of those are fairly short format. They're anthologies with short format scenarios inside. And as a new writer, you can look at how scenarios were written, 40 years ago, and then look at how scenarios are being written today, and do what you can to maybe analyze and take it apart. Look at Doors to Darkness and see how each of those scenarios are broken down. There's an introduction, and then there's keeper's information, and there's getting the investigators involved. And with your idea, after you've kind of put down your bullets and you're saying, okay, I kind of see what my arc is, but now I'm faced with actually trying to write it. Don't think of it as I have to write this scenario. Just look at like Doors to Darkness and say, okay, I just want to write the introduction. And look at 2 or 3 of the different scenarios that are indoors and go and count it out. Literally count out their words. Okay, this introduction has 150 words, and this one has 130 words. I'm going to write an introduction, and I want it to fall between 100 and 130 words, and that should be a good enough. Can I conceptualize my idea into an introduction that's 100 words long, and just write that, and then be happy, maybe work it 2-3 times, but get your introduction, save that document, and then go on to the next. Keeper information, save that document, go on. When you patch it together like this, before you know it, you've written a scenario. And by analyzing the way that modern scenarios are being written, you're writing a scenario that is in that same vein, and modern audiences are going to understand the format because they're already familiar with it and receiving it. And another thing that writers should remember is you're writing for an audience of one. You're writing for the guy, the woman who is going to be running the scenario, interpreting your words, and having this, conversation, this game conversation with their friends. It's not like a novel where everybody at the table is going to read the exact same words and have the exact same experience. You're writing for one person who then interprets for their friends. So, Oscar? I think you might be.
Yeah, you're on mute, Oscar.
Sorry. To go back to Mike's point about keeping the ideas simple, I'm working with a lot of younger authors now, which is easy because I'm old. And they'll come up with a scenario idea, and it'll be like, okay, so there's this vampire sorceress, and she's in love with this Mygo agent, and they're trying to stop a Shoggoth who is trying to summon, Ygolianok. And I'm like, okay, you've got a vampire scenario, you've got a Mygo agent scenario, you've got a Shoggoth scenario, and you've got a Ygolianok scenario. You don't need to put all of these elements in one scenario. You can write another scenario. If this goes well, you'll be writing lots of scenarios. Let's just try and make the vampire sorceress scenario as good as possible. And it's And I'm looking at my younger work, and I did that too. I had you have all these ideas, and you feel like, I'm never going to write another scenario. I've got to get all these good ideas out into the world because they're good ideas. And like, yes, there's good ideas, but you don't want to mix 5 different kinds of soup together. It's going to be gross. Just let's make 5 different bowls of soup. And again,
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say Oscar's absolutely right. I mean, the way I tend to look at it, because the way I get approached about this is, I get a person that's never written for publication before, never written for anyone else other than themselves in terms of their own homebrews, and their first idea is to write a campaign, and they say, I want to write kind of like my version of Masks of Nyarlathotep, and I go, well, that's great. That's a fantastic ambition to have. But that's not what you're going to be doing straight away, because I guarantee if you start to try and write a campaign, a multi-part campaign, you will, 1, not finish it, 2, you will burn yourself out, and 3, you'll never write anything again, because they are icebergs of work. You see this, and how many years of work that goes into actually putting a campaign together. My advice is always that's a great ambition to have, but start off, just write the first scenario in the campaign. Forget about the actual rest of the campaign. Just write the first scenario, and if that works, great. Then write a second scenario, and if down the line they may all link together, that's great. But don't worry about that now. Just
Ramses,
make it workable. Make it piecemeal work you can do.
Yeah, so let's talk about how to make one of the soups that Oscar was describing then, and that's sort of the writing process itself. Because we've talked about kind of where do these ideas come from. We've talked about kind of scoping your work appropriately, not taking on too much. But what are the actual steps of writing? And I know we've already talked a little bit about looking at scenarios. John mentioned, looking at sections and kind of writing those. But in terms of, first draft, second draft, proofreading, editing, playtesting, what are the different steps in the writing process for you? And I'm going to turn it over to Matt, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the biggest part for me, once I've got at least the idea for that scenario and that central axis upon which everything revolves around, is playtesting. Because you can write up such a detailed plot that you think, oh, this is really good. I'm happy with how this flows from one thing to another. They've got loads of options for the PCs. You put it in front of players, they will break it. No perfect plan survives contact with the enemy. You have to get it out there and see how it works as a game with players, because if you don't, guaranteed something is going to break, because players will find a way around every little intricate thing that you have planned. So I'll playtest the hell out of scenarios 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes up to a dozen times, just to see what works, what doesn't work, what needs refining, what do they think of that I haven't covered. And that is, for me, the biggest part of the development, that you can't not playtest a scenario.
And Matt, where do you tend to do most of your playtesting? Is it with a set group of folks, or do you take your idea to conventions and sort of say, hey, this is something that's still in the works, but let's try it? How does that work?
As many different groups as possible, not using the same group repeatedly over and over again, because they tend to then fall into a groove of knowing what you can potentially write or seeing certain tricks that you have up your sleeve every so often. So yeah, I've taken things to conventions multiple times, but usually towards the end of that process, where it's as refined as I can get it. So I want to present the best possible version of it in a convention circuit, because I have no idea who are potentially going to have to sign up to play it. But I have numerous groups that I can meet either in person. Pre-COVID, I would travel to various places to go visit different groups. But now I've got different groups I can draw from online. So yeah, there's many different groups as possible.
John, what about you? What are sort of the steps in your writing process?
Yeah, I will do exactly what I was saying, which is I'll look at how the new scenarios are being written, and I'll kind of block out and say, okay, I want to have these headers. I'm going to have an intro. I'm going to have a keeper information. And I look at how information is blocked together, because I think about the end product, and when someone is needing to use that book as a reference when they're running the game, you want them to be able to get to information quickly. So I want to have headers that make sense. Maybe it's a location name. They're going to go to this house, or maybe it's an important person that they're going to be talking to. So I'll have a header for that person because they've got critical information. And so I want to try and block out my information, know how I want it blocked out, and then start writing for those blocks. And then I have to credit Matt. Play testing is key. Sometimes I'll play test just scenes. I might say, okay, this is the how the investigators are introduced to it, and maybe it feels like it might go one way as I'm conceptualizing it and writing it down, and so then I'll run it. And I've had some that just absolutely blew up in my face, and I was like, okay, well, I'm glad I did that, because I know that what I wrote does not work at all. And so then I take that back down to studs and have to rewrite that. And it's great being able to do this kind of stuff online, because I might be able to just put a call out and say, hey, does anybody have an hour to kill, an hour and a half to kill? I just want to play this one scene. And it's easy to do that. And you can break that up into your playtests into little bits as well. Play vignettes, if you will.
Well, John, I can see in chat you are getting a thumbs up on the quality of your user-friendly structures.
Oh, thank you.
Well done. I'm going to have the same question for Oscar and Mike, but before that, just a quick follow-up on Matt's point of playtesting, and yours as well, John, which is, do you always run the playtest yourself, or does there come a point when you sort of have something and you give it to someone else and say, I'd like you to run this to see if what I think is user-friendly is in fact user-friendly?
I have done that, but it is usually further down the line when I feel like it is closer to completion. And I have a friend in Australia. I might send it to him, so he's got a whole other group of friends that he has normal contact with than I do, and so I'll figure out from him how that is going. I do, but it's towards the end.
Matt?
Yeah, I normally try to keep things in-house. There'll be a lot of bouncing around. If I send it in for a collection, if it's something that's going to be published, then there's normally a bit of bouncing around between myself and likewise Mike and so on, going through, does this work, does this maybe not work? Sometimes that can happen at the beginning of the process if we're trying to outline if it's going in a particular collection that has a particular theme, so that we're both on the same page from the start. Or when it goes in, if this is something that's maybe a bit more generic or something that's maybe standalone, then it could be discussion that happens after. But yeah, normally I handle all the playtesting myself. I like to keep it all in my own head.
Can I just mention something about playtesting?
Yeah.
I think it's a really valid point, asking the question about whether you give your scenario to somebody else to run. And I think as you get more experienced, you may need to do that less, to be honest, or may not need to do it at all, because you kind of you've got the experience of having written quite a few scenarios or whatever. You get the kind of idea how they're actually going to play, and then you can play test that to confirm or deny that. But if you're newer to scenario design, I think giving it, once you've written the whole scenario and you've play tested it yourself and you refined it a little bit, I think then is a really good time to give it to somebody else to run. And the reason I say that is because one of the common kind of, not an error, but a downfall of new writers is they forget to write what's in their head when they run the scenario. So they may have written a wonderful scene in describe the room and the monster and all that kind of thing. But when they run it, they always have the monster do this thing, or they wait for this point in the scene to do this thing, but they haven't actually written that in the scenario. So anyone else running the scenario would run that scene differently to how they intend it to run. So by giving it somebody else to run and sort of saying, and maybe even watching them play it, or listen, or asking the questions, how did that scene happen when you ran it? you can then learn whether, or be reminded that actually you've not actually written all that you thought you had, because some of the stuff is stayed in your head as a GM, and you need to distill the GM stuff and put it on the page so somebody else can understand what your intention with that scene is.
A lot of time to speak on that point. When you speak to a new author about them, they said, "Well, I thought that was obvious." I'm like, "Well, no. If it was obvious, I would have gotten that from what you'd written. It's obvious now that you're explaining it to me. Now you need to explain it in the scenario for everyone." But again, as to Mike's point, it's a very common new author mistake. Usually, a new author's giving you a scenario, they have another 1,500 words to write. They just don't know it yet.
Mike, Oscar, did want to go back to the question of sort of the writing process and what you see as the steps. And obviously, we don't want to get too much into the publishing side, but I'm wondering whether, just by virtue of having reviewed a lot of scenarios and whether to put them out or working with the author on, how to improve them, what you sort of see as the important steps that maybe folks aren't thinking of when they sit down to write.
I think, while a good scenario isn't fiction, it isn't a short story, it isn't a novel, it's a completely different format, there are certain rules that you kind of need to follow. You need to have a start and you need to have an end. And because of that, you will have a middle, hopefully, as well. So I think focusing on, what is a cool way to start this scenario? Is it a kind of is it a slow burn Maltese Falcon with somebody walking in the room to say, "Help, I need your help to do this thing"? Or is it starting in media res where, "Hey, you're all standing in a room, it's burning all around you. How you got here, I don't know, but what are you doing?" What is a cool way to start that gets people engaged and motivated to play the scenario with their characters? And then ending is, don't be too prescriptive about the ending. You'll have an ending that you favor. And that might be we shoot the monster. It might be we cast a spell to banish the monster. It may be we take him to the police station. I don't know, whatever it is. There may be your favorite one, and that's fine. And you can write that in, but stop then and then think about all the other possible ways that this scenario could end. Because it may not be combat. It may be magic. It may be calamitous environmental effects. I don't know. But then normally, and there should be more than one way to end this scenario, because all the players in the world that are going to play this scenario will find a different way to end the scenario. So your job is to try and help the keeper to try and predict what are the main ways it could end. And here's some advice on how you might draw it to an end because of that. So focus on those kind of things. And basically, I think John mentioned about headings. Think about the navigation of the campaign. How does it flow? Is it logical? Are you making any big assumptions that actually aren't really logical? If the players are told there's a clue to be found at the library, then they're probably going to go to the library. That's great. But if you haven't told them there's a clue at the library, then why on earth would they go? Yeah. So think about the logic flow. Think about the logic of your NPCs. Are they doing realistic things? Or are they sitting in a room waiting for the PCs to turn up? Because that isn't realistic. What is real? Try and base it in some form of reality, as in what would people normally do in this situation, whether they're an evil cultist or a police officer or whoever. Those are the kind of, there's so many things, but those are the kind of things I would maybe focus down on to start with, perhaps.
Oscar had a nice phrase he used earlier, which was figuring out the rhythm of a scenario. And Oscar, I'm wondering if you can maybe expound on that notion and how it goes into the steps of your writing process.
Yeah, there's lots of flavors of scenarios. Cosmic horror is cosmic horror, but you could do survival horror cosmic horror. You could do investigative cosmic horror. You can do gothic cosmic horror. What vibe, what's the pacing? What color of fear do you want to install in your players? And you need to write to that, just so you can plan the ways you're going to manage their tension level throughout the narrative. But again, that's a technique that's, developed over time. This is not something I want to scare new authors with. That's something they can start thinking about on their 5th adventure. How to manage pacing and tone. At this point, it's more about filtering the good ideas, the best ideas, organizing your thoughts, presenting your thoughts in an organized fashion, and remaining motivated to getting it done. What you're talking about would be panel 103 in this series. I wouldn't, and again, my co-panelists are smiling, so I think that they agree with me that that's more of that's more of a technique that you would develop when you're kind of moving into the intermediate away from the beginner phase. But to the question you asked earlier, I think outlining of your when you get started, you write your intro, you write for the keeper, you write hooking the investigators, getting different ways your investigators will get involved in the scenarios. Then you write your narrative sections and your scenes and your possible scenes. And again, to back up Mike, I tell myself this, and I tell new authors this all the time. You do not own the narrative. The players own the narrative. It's their ending to choose. It's not yours. You're writing possibilities. You're writing variables. They're writing the story. The story doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. You may have a favorite ending, like Mike said, or even 2 favorite endings, but that's not you don't own that ending. The players running that scenario own whatever ending they're going to make. And it could be abandoning, a child at the bottom of a well because they're too afraid to fight the monster guarding it. It could be getting bought off by the Deep One hybrids and taking $5,000 instead of ending their nefarious plot. It could be an ending that, you find repulsive, but it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the group. So you can write in a way that you limit their choices, and you can funnel their actions to a conclusion you like. But that's called railroading, and nobody likes to play those sorts of games. So for a new author, please keep that in mind. And you don't want to limit out the choices and the variables you don't like, because that's not fair to the players. You're there to entertain them. You're not there to herd them into the ending or the situations that you most like. 3 different groups can have 3 different play styles and play games in 3 fundamentally different ways. And as long as they're having fun playing through it, then they're doing their job. And as long as you are writing it and running it to allow them to have fun, then you're doing yours.
Can I throw in one other tip I've just thought about? I mentioned about it not being fiction, and unlike fiction, please don't make it a mystery for the keeper. So if you look at many old, John said earlier, Call of Cthulhu is 40 years old next year. There's some very old scenarios written, and some of them are great, but a lot of them treat the keeper as if they're playing the mystery, and they don't reveal what is going on in the scenario until you've read it to the end. That's no use to me. If I'm trying to pick a scenario I want to read, I want to play, I want to know in the first paragraph, what is this scenario about? And then in the second paragraph, what's the plot? Tell me what's at stake. Tell me what happens if the investigators all die on the first day and never finish it. What happens? What's at stake? And just be clear to the keeper, because you're trying to help the keeper run this. That's your job when you write this down. You're helping the keeper, giving them a bunch of information and clues and tools to run this mystery for other people. You want them to be as expert as you are, the writer who came up with it.
And if I may, because I know we're getting close on time, because you're writing this is a game, and specifically Call of Cthulhu. The players, their investigators, have a whole host of skills. This is a skill-based game, and it's an investigative horror game, so it's dependent upon clues. As a writer, find creative ways to leverage the host of skills that are out there. Not every clue needs to be discovered through spot hidden. Spot hidden's a great skill, and it comes in play a lot, but don't make every skill a spot hidden reward, right? Don't have, them roll that skill and get the clue as a reward. Maybe they have to go through some bookkeeping, right? So accounting is going to be a great skill for players to leverage, and their reward is they're going to get information by using those skills. I'm in the process of writing something right now. And in this, I want the players to discover a newspaper article, and so they can go through and they can do the library use to see if they can find this newspaper article after they spend X number of hours invested in their search. As a writer, think about what the consequences are if they fail that role. So for me, I put in there, if they fail it, then have any NPC mention, even nonchalantly, how, oh my goodness, isn't it weird that location, there were 2 incidences of gunfire at that location in the 20 years that it's been open. Isn't that weird? Well, now that an NPC has said that there were 2 gunfights at that location, now you can give them the clue, but the pros and cons for that is, if I have to give it to them because an NPC said something, they don't get the little check mark in their skill, right? So as a player, you want to try and earn those check marks so you can hopefully, level up and get your improvements. But if I give it to you for free, hey, you just, you still got it, but the mystery carries on. So as the writer for a game system, think about not only how is the keeper going to present the information, but think about the ways that your players are going to be interfacing with each of these scenes. What skills do they come to bear, and what are the rewards for bringing those skills to bear?
So as we go into the last third of our discussion here, time-wise, I want to make sure that we do have some time for questions from chat as well. And one of the questions sort of, I think, segues nicely into where we are right now, which is, how do you know when you're done? How do you know when it's, in a sense, good enough? Right? I think many of us feel like something can always be improved. You can always do another draft. You can always do another playtest. Maybe every time you playtest, a new good idea, comes up that you incorporate, and you might think, when will I ever be done with it? So Matt, I'm wondering if you can take the lead on answering this question for our chat.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it comes partly back down to playtesting. That once you've run it through several times and nothing new comes out of it, that it seems to be all the avenues that the player groups are going to explore have come up. But also, and keyly important to that, when you as the author have sat down, read through it, thought, this bit needs a bit of expansion to explain this. This bit needs a little bit of polishing. When you are completely happy with it and there are no nagging doubts, that you realize that you have covered every base and you've gone through it enough times that you think, yeah, there is nothing left to polish, then it's done. And there is bound to be something that comes through the net. That's inevitable. But at least when you are happy with it, and when you know you're happy with it, you'll know when that moment comes.
Oscar, it sounded like you had.
Yeah. One of my favorite authors is Frazetta, and there's a great story of his that he says basically he wasn't allowed into his own museum anymore. He had a museum of his work on his property because in the middle of the night a couple of times he went into his museum and started to retouch up some of his masterworks hanging there. And his wife got so pissed off at him, she changed the locks and wouldn't give him the key, so he wouldn't go in and paint over and alter these masterpieces that he had earlier done. The danger is you could never be done with working on a scenario. You can always find, oh, wouldn't it be great if this guy had a sister and we could add this whole red herring? You know, it's done when you just stop being an ass and turn it into your editor and you get paid. You could work on these things forever if you let yourself. The thing is, don't let yourself do that. Get to the point where you're happy with it, turn it in, have your editor accept it, have your publisher pay you, and then move on. And then if you're lucky and you get old like me, there'll be a new edition of the game, and then you get to go back and update all of your old scenarios, which is what I do a lot now. I'm updating a lot of my 6th edition scenarios, and I'm updating them for more modern gaming tastes, which are way more sandbox than Railroad, and updating them to a whole new edition. So I'm lucky enough to, for example, I got to update Ripples from Carcosa from 6th to 7th, and from a monograph to a main book. So in that case, I thought I was done, and then I wasn't, and now I am, because I've been paid and I have to move on. But yeah, the danger is you could never be done. You have to push those baby birds out of the nest and move on to something else eventually.
Well, there's other advice I've seen outside the context of writing for Call of Cthulhu. That's something along the effect of once you reach 80% happiness with a product, you might want to consider, getting it out the door if you find yourself lingering on it. But I'm wondering if that advice is applicable or the way to go in this context. Mike, what are your thoughts?
This actually ties into a question somebody just asked. Is that once you upload a PDF to the repository, you can replace it, you can update it, put up a new. If you put it up and you then think to yourself a week later, you know what, I completely forgot, or I realized I missed something out, or what I'd written I meant to change because it causes a problem. You then just go in, go to your original, make that correction, change it, make a new PDF, replace the PDF on the repository. You can constantly hone them in that way. So it's a great opportunity to get, I think, as I said in the beginning, feedback on your scenarios. And in terms of understanding when the scenario is done or not, you've got to just kind of bite the bullet at some point and go like, I think it's done. I'm not sure. Maybe give it to somebody to just read or play and say, does that, did that, do you have any questions after reading it? Does it kind of work? And getting that kind of another, fresh pair of eyes, it could help. And if you haven't got a fresh pair of eyes, maybe you could jump on one of the Call of Cthulhu forums like the BRP Central and just ask, would somebody mind reading my scenario? And if you really don't want to do that and you're just going to go gung-ho and put it on the repository, then fine. Put it on the repository, ask for feedback, look at the forums, tell people it's available, and then ask people to give you feedback. And if the feedback comes back, really bad, fine. Just take it off the repository, work on it some more based on the feedback, and then post it up again,
I'll give a shout out to the Miskatonic Creator Circle on Facebook, which is a place that if you join it and you ever ask for sort of editing help or brainstorming help, the community is very willing to jump in and review. So recommend that to everyone listening. John, we've got a lot of great questions in chat that I want to make sure we get to. One that I wanted to send your way was Call of Cthulhu. It's a horror game. We all have experiences of TPKs, total party kills, or where total failure is possible. How do you write for a game where that kind of level of failure, everyone dying or everyone insane, is a distinct possibility, and so the scenario might not conclude in sort of a satisfactory fashion?
Yeah, the total party kill is something that you have to sometimes keep in mind. Like, if I bring this monster to bear, is this going to be the end game for this scenario? And sometimes it might be. So you might want to try and gauge your scenario so that you kind of keep the the confrontations with something that is that powerful, kind of try and keep it towards the end. As they're starting their investigation and they go to the wharf, maybe don't have 3 deep ones jump them in the first scenario. Maybe use that scenario for them to find evidence of previous deep one attacks, and then as the players are gathering their clues and gaining information and they get deeper into this, maybe the next time they go to the wharf, that could be when the deep ones come out. But by that point, they should have been adequately warned that people get jumped at the wharf. So yeah, you want to try and keep your confrontations, if at all possible, more towards the end, because a TPK is a legitimate ending. As Oscar said, the players own the ending, and if they want to go running full bore at the enemy, don't stop them. Let them go.
Matt, another question that I'm going to send your way. Question from chat: would you include red herrings for one shot? This is, I think, a pretty popular question. I've had it myself. Or is that too much complication for one evening of play? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I generally try to avoid red herrings in one-shots. But one technique I have employed is not so much of a red herring, but setting something up as something, but then making it something else, so the story still goes somewhere. So, for example, one scenario that I've written involves a hook where a friend or an acquaintance asks you, "Look, I think someone's trying to break into my house late at night. I think it's some kind of terror tactic." But it's not how that NPC presents things to the players. They will start to realize, yeah, something is going on, but it's not that they're trying to scare the occupant. It's that they're trying to do something else. So that kind of a red herring, in inverted commas, yes, but something that goes off on a completely different direction for a complete waste of time tangent, hell no, because you've got such a limited time at the table anyway to get a scenario done. And that can be frustrating to certain players, me included. So yeah, I would tend to steer away from that. In a bigger campaign, as long as it's an entertaining side quest, maybe. But again, not to overshadow the main plot, definitely not.
Mike, I saw you give a vigorous nod in assent there. What are your thoughts?
I just think, I think we're talking about people maybe starting writing or in their early phases, writers, and red herrings kind of always sound really cool, but often they're just going to take people out of the scenario, because players being players. You mentioned there's an old well at the end of the farm that's got nothing to do with the scenario. And guess what? Where they're going to spend all their time? They're going to spend it all at the old well. And they're going to be going down that well. They're going to be assuming all sorts of wonderful things are at the bottom of that well. And all it is, you filled in you drew a map of the farm and it was blank. And you just, draw a well there just because it kind of fills out the map. And it's yeah, I think be very careful with red herrings. Avoid them really until you're really comfortable in terms of why you're putting it in. I think is the trick there.
Oscar, we had a question in chat specifically for you, which was we're aware of kind of the a lot of the works you've done in other time periods. Ripples is actually an example of that, but Invictus kind of most obviously. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about sourcebook writing and writing in time periods outside of the classic 1920s or modern.
Wow.
It's a short question, obviously.
Well, educate yourself. Do not rely solely on the internet. Do not rely solely on Wikipedia. Go on Amazon and order a whole bunch of used books. Don't get the new ones. Just get the used ones are cheaper. If you're researching for scenarios, do it on the cheap. Download the PDFs. Put them on a tablet if you can. But really read, really educate yourselves. There's wonderful books out there. A lot of them written history light. They're more fun. They're not as academic. both for the 20s and for ancient Rome, Dark Ages, whatever. There's a lot of great resources out there. Just don't limit yourself. Excuse me. And also realize that historians don't often agree on terms. Things can go one way or another. In your game universe, decide what is and stick with that. You've got monsters running around, so it's obviously not real history. So if real historians disagree on whether this was period or that was period, don't get hung up on it. Choose it. You're already writing something with deep ones, so you're already off the history reservation anyway.
Or are we? Questions for the panel. One of our participants in chat asking for a friend. They really love Blood Brothers and want to write adventures like this in 7th edition. Are there any suggestions or inspirations that they can look to?
I think the easy answer to that is Blood Brothers were, just so everyone knows, they were. There was a couple of books of Blood Brothers done some years ago, and they were basically Call of Cthulhu scenarios where there was no mythos. They were kind of very much based on the kind of creature feature, monster movies, that kind of thing. And so there would be monsters in them and that kind of thing, but they wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the mythos. And I think, the inspiration for those scenarios came out of, horror stories, but mainly horror films. So in terms of somebody wanting to kind of write a scenario without the mythos, then, that same inspiration still applies. There's been many horror films released, since those books were originally put out. It's just a cool, what's a cool, creepy idea? What would be a fun encounter if you don't want to include the mythos? It's kind of the Scooby-Doo version of Call of Cthulhu, or whatever it is. You want to run Friday the 13th as Call of Cthulhu? Well, that's fine. You create Jason and have him ruin your holiday. That's just, is whatever the game is, whatever you want it to be. But use the inspiration to build that, and obviously you can take a mythos monster and strip it out of the mythos and call it something else, and not just reuse the stats and the attacks, and there you've got a monster, without much work. Use what we produce as you will in that way, I guess, is my advice.
John, go ahead.
I think if you took out the mythos tome from The Haunting, it's basically just a haunted house.
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of scenarios are like that. If you edit it out 3 or 4 paragraphs, they're a Blood Brothers scenario already.
Question from chat that I'm going to tweak slightly. There's questions of, how much history is too much history? How much do you want to include in a scenario? I think we're all familiar with the Wikipedia rabbit hole that lost, ourselves in for days. But John, Matt, in doing your historical research, how much do you include? And question for me, could you talk a little bit about how you write player handouts and the extent to which you try and incorporate history there, or not? Because I think that's something that some of us don't think about in terms of the writing angle, but most scenarios do have handouts of one type or another.
Matt, please go ahead.
I was going to say I'll defer to you first, but
I'm very gracious, John.
I can think of one instance where this came up, actually when we were working on Nameless Horrors with me, Scott Dodd, and Paul Fricker. One of my scenarios in there was very historically focused. It's set in almost a Dark Ages period town, the historic Dunwich port. And I wrote up this long description of that, the history of the history of the port, what had happened there, how it had grown over time, and then describing the locales and such. And then Scott did the editing, threw it back to me, and said, "This is great, but none of it is none of it is relevant to the scenario." So I learnt the lesson the hard way there. That put stuff in, if it might be interesting, but unless it's relevant to what the keeper needs to run the scenario and what the players will realistically find out, then pitch it, because it's using up word count, and you've only got so many words to put the scenario together if you're doing it for publication usually. So it's keep it interesting, keep it to the point, and for God's sake, keep it relevant. That's the key thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, history is compared to modern sensibilities can be quite ugly, and I, by design, I just simply omit parts of history that I find ugly, the racism and stuff. I don't want to bring that or highlight it in my scenarios. Sexism, I'm not interested in that. And so, in my scenarios, no matter the time period, women as NPCs might have prominent roles in police stations, and can be great sources of information. Same thing for people of color. I'm not interested in trying to promote those aspects of history. So I just excise it, and that's something that I'll leave to the table that's playing the game for them to decide on how relevant that's going to be in their game. So I'm not going to have any of my scenarios dictate that. As far as handouts go, I'm actually also trying to write a handout right now that is a journal, right? The villain's personal journal. And I had to ask myself, I'm like, why would this guy write this journal? And it came to me, this guy is writing this journal because this is something that he himself goes back upon and would reread in order to re-experience the thrill of the bad things that he's doing. That's why he puts it down. It's not to put down a clue trail to try and catch him. This is his way, his personal way of re-experiencing and enjoying the bad stuff that he's doing. That's why he's writing it down. And so now it becomes something that is a relevant clue to find. And so I have to put myself into this mindset of this terrible person who's writing these terrible things just for himself. And I'm like, I feel dirty writing this, but I have to get it down because this is, I think, going to be a really great handout.
Great, thanks for that. I'm just giving chat here a minute if there's a final question or missed any. Oscar?
Yeah, I have to chime in on John's point, unfortunately. As a person of color, I find shying away from the darker aspects of human nature and history to be very dangerous and not good for moving this genre of gaming forward. My company did an entire collection of scenarios focused on the darker aspects of human nature and history, with sexism, racism. I think by candy coating some of the historical aspects, you're not shying away, but you are candy coating. And I think part of the strength and the power of gaming in a historical period is educating people as to the realities of that historical period. I find it a way of mixing the medicine in with a bowl of cheese for a dog. You can teach players about the history and trick them into experiencing that in a way that they feel through role playing. But to have a mythical 1920s with no racism and no sexism, I'd find that more horrible than having a 1920s where there are Shoggoths and deep ones. We need to learn from these historical lessons, and if we can learn from them through gaming, then we should. To pretend these things didn't happen, I think you're really missing a huge part of the argument there. But I don't want to get off topic. I just felt the need to speak up. I didn't want to be silent to that point of view.
No, and that's good.
And I apologize if I'm, going off in an area that we shouldn't explore. Back to the questions, John, and you and I can talk later.
Yeah.
But I'd rather let the fans ask some questions here about writing. That's what what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, and I do want to just say it's not my story to tell. So I appreciate, it's great that you're out there to say that, and that Chris Spivey is out there to say that, and it will be much more authentic than if I was to attempt to do that. But that's awesome. Yeah.
So I think that's those are all good points, and where it connects also to the writing is one of the things that came up yesterday during the publishing panel was the use of sensitivity readers and sort of individuals that have the cultural background to maybe spot some of the gaps that all of us have about different things. Some specific, some larger, some smaller. Matt, I see you nodding to that. Do you have experience using sensitivity readers for your writing?
Not for Call of Cthulhu, but for a different game line, yes. Because it was a scenario that involved with a very adult theme and one that is quite controversial. So it was one thing that me and the editing team went through was to say, yes, we want a sensitivity read to have a look at this to make sure it's not pushing the wrong buttons, that it's being very impartial and so on, and make it very clear in the introduction that this scenario is about this particular topic. If you or your players are not happy about this, do not play it. That make it very clear that it's going to touch some issues and not suddenly jump it on them in the players in the course of play. Give them fair warning. This is what this scenario is about.
Trigger warnings right after the heading.
And I'll say again, another plug for using the resources that folks have available. If you're looking for readers who can help you with some of those cultural gaps that you may be aware of, you may not be aware of, just ask. Folks tend to be really helpful on that. Gentlemen, we are nearing the end. We've gone through the questions from chat, so I want to go around before some final additions from me relating to the convention itself, to give each of you sort of a chance of new authors on the Miskatonic Repository, authors who are trying to up their game, trying to figure out what they can do to improve. What are your sort of concluding thoughts on the writing process and what folks should keep an eye out for? Mike, I'll give you the first word.
Yeah, thanks. I guess a lot of my thoughts are written down in the rulebook, the Call of Cthulhu rulebook, and I know people don't like sitting reading rule books, and I know it's a big rule book, and I know that actually there's not actually a lot of rules in there. There's a lot of advice and material in there. But chapter 10 of the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition rulebook, called Playing the Game, has a section on creating scenarios, has a section on when to roll dice, which is really important. When to actually ask your players to roll dice, because I see this in a lot of scenarios where anytime you could roll a dice, the new writer will write it in. Make a roll. And actually, you've got to be kind of careful about how you make rolls. You also need to understand the difference between obscure and obvious clues, because sometimes you don't need to make any rolls because you don't need to. So please, if you're going to write for Call of Cthulhu, use the rule book. Please read chapter 10. It's not got all the answers, certainly not got all the answers, but it's got some advice, and it's a useful reminder to kind of just flick over that once in a while. That would be my tip. My other tip is, as I said earlier, if you want to write for Call of Cthulhu, then my tip is write for Call of Cthulhu, because if you can do that, then you will hopefully carry on writing, and then you will be writing stuff, hopefully, that Oscar and me and other people and yourself as a self-publisher on the Miskatonic Repository will be getting your stuff out there and played, and that's what it's all about.
John, would you share your final thoughts with us?
Yeah, find a story that you're passionate about, and do what you can to get that scenario onto paper. Everyone who's interested in writing gets interested because there's something that touched them, and they're like, I have this idea that I want to get down that I think players would enjoy. So find that and work on that. And as soon as you get that first one down, then the others will come easier.
Awesome. Thank you. Matt?
I've got two things that come to mind that I think are key. One, when you've got the story and you're writing, or scenario rather, and you're writing it up, don't be afraid to create something wholly new. Don't try and shoehorn in mythos somewhere because you think, oh, this is a creature that's in the core book, therefore I've only got this to use. If you can think of something that is wholly original and that is wholly appropriate to the story that you've written, by all means, put it in. And also, remember that it is a game that you're writing, that players do have a part to play in this, that it's not a short story that says this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and that's it. The players just get to watch the flashing lights. They do get an active part in the story, and you should remember that.
Oscar, I'll give the final word to you then.
Okay. The two things I think a new author should really keep in mind that nobody talks about are motivation and humility. Talent is easy. Lots of people are talented. Motivation is hard. To sit down, to write, to continue writing, to finish, to play test, to edit and improve, and then finally put out, that's motivation. Lots of people are talented. Motivated people end up having careers, and they end up being successful, even if they're less talented than some of the really great authors, because you're the ones getting things done. Things don't exist until they're done. And the flip side of that is humility. Once you have stuff out, there are going to be people who don't like it. Don't attack them. Don't attack your critics. Look at what the criticism is. Try and accept it. If you can find a mentor that you trust and they rip apart your work and tell you everything wrong with it, but tell you how to fix it, accept it with gratitude and work on yourself to improve your skills as a writer. Any writer that thinks that they're at the top of their game and will never improve, they're kidding themselves. Writers are always growing. They're always improving, no matter where they are. And it should be the same if you're a new author or an established author. Take your criticism and strive to improve. Always strive to improve.
Thanks, Oscar. And I can see in chat there's a few folks I think kind of lowering their head and going, yes, I know I need to be motivated and finish the things I said. So I think your advice is well taken, as is the advice all of you have provided. I cannot thank you enough on behalf of MRCon 2020 for participating in this panel. Myself and the other organizers think we've got a community growing through the repository. Grateful to Chaosium, Golden Goblin, everyone else for helping to foster that. And we want to encourage, as organizers, everyone watching to get involved. If you need help brainstorming, editing, playtesting, sensitivity readers, all of that, lean on the community that's out there, lean on the community we're trying to create here. You can reach me at heinrichmohr@gmail.com. Links will be in the chat. You can also reach me through Discord, as well as any of the other organizers. We wanted to conclude by taking this opportunity to also announce our next community project, which is going to be a MR Classical Era collection, focusing on the 1920s and some of its themes, like Prohibition, jazz, the roaring part of those roaring 20s, Lenin's Russia, Weimar Germany, all of that good stuff, to get put out early May of next year. So if that is of interest, reach out to Marek Lanka, who is organizing it and who is also responsible for organizing the Halloween bundle that is on sale now. So thank you also for him. And once again, thank you to all the panelists. We really appreciate your time and wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you for running it.